Hey, everybody. Happy Independence Day weekend. Week 117 on the wacky train. It's just Jack and Gary today because Adam is having way too much fun in Costa Rica. I've seen some of the pictures and it looks beautiful. And it's a friend of mine's, actually the guy that we featured on the Anything But Typical podcast, Andy Hilliard. It's his place in Costa Rica because he served in the Peace Corps in Costa Rica. That's where he met his wife. And he's bought this really cool house and he's renting it probably for a really good deal to Adam and his family. So it looks like they're having fun. You guys know the drill. Hit us up on Q&A with any questions. We're happy to help in any way that we can. We are going to be talking about recession proofing business in this crazy world. Man, the last 2.5 years have just been crazy. And yet we're still here. We're still here. So crazy after all these years. If you do have anything that you want us to hit, like we will, I'll do a little bit of a rehash on some of the stuff that we went through last week. And here's the deal. If anybody was not on last week or anybody didn't get access to the vault so that they could see this, the recession proof checklist, let us know. You can email me at gfrey@trustbgw.com. And it'll be tonight probably before I get back. I've got meetings all the rest of the afternoon. But we will get you access so that you can go visit our vault. And if you're not a BGW client already, but we'll give you access to that and give you a pass so that you can get in. Also, this has something to do with recession proofing in a little bit. This happened to me 9 days ago. So simple thing, I bought a new iPhone. My other one, the battery was starting to blow out. So new iPhone, right? Should be a simple thing. Hey, I will not reveal the provider. It's not about shaming them, but it should be a simple porting of a number. Hey, take my number, port it over to this phone from the old phone. I'll turn in the old phone and it'll all be good. Did the same with my wife. 7 hours Tuesday night, a week ago, we had a problem and we didn't even know how bad the problem was. The rep did not know what they were doing. They added 2 lines to my account that I did not know about, and they released the line that I've had tied to this phone that I've had for 20 years. And it's a 216 area code because we moved to Cleveland, Ohio from Charlotte in 2002. And I'm like, well, hey, we're going to be in Cleveland. Might as well have a local number. Well, when we moved back 7 years ago, it's tied to everything. And beyond that, 2-factor authentication. I was locked out of all of our company systems, critical systems from my computer. I couldn't access remotely because of this issue. And needless to say, 17 plus hours on the phone with them, getting nowhere. Unempowered employees in this 90,000 plus employee company. And I'm not trying to bash them. And I've asked people, please don't crucify whoever it was that made this mistake. But it was a living hell to deal with this. I'm telling you, I had credit card refusals. Like I bought an American Airlines ticket. I'm on a board up in Ohio, have to fly up there. They're like, hey, book the flight. I booked the flight. 2 days later, I still don't have a receipt. They denied it because of 2-factor authentication. Crazy. And here's the way I got a resolution. I MacGyvered the CEO's email address. I tried 9 different email addresses all in the same 2, and one of them hit. And then I found his assistant. And I did the same. And I said, hey, by the way, CEO got this. Would you please make sure he sees this? Well, that day, yesterday, I had 3 people, 1 from the executive offices and then 2 from the field, various parts of the country, that were on it and fixed it. It should not take that. It should not take that. So here's the long and the short, as far as I'm concerned, with this story. 1, 2-factor authentication, it really works. You can't bust in. But what happens if your phone, if something like this happens? This is probably not the first time this has ever happened to somebody, but I wasn't a 15-year-old kid, missing my TikTok account. I actually had business, and I couldn't get anybody to return my call. And if they did, it went to a voicemail that I couldn't access. That was the other thing. Just one thing after another. But a couple things. One is I got to find a backup. Like, what do I do? Because credit cards, everything else tied to that. So I'm going to do some more checking, because this is really crazy. 2 is, if you are not empowering your people and your organization, and they are hamstrung and they cannot solve the problem, you got a problem in your company. And this is a 90,000 person company, and a lot of people hate them, but quite frankly, every mobile carrier stinks as far as I'm concerned. They all have problems. You get so and so big and you got issues. So training, and empowerment. And they're going to do a post-mortem on this thing from what they've told me. And I said, whatever you do, please don't crucify whoever made the mistake. It was an honest mistake, but man, if somebody can release your number into the ether. And here's the other thing: you got 30 days before another carrier can get it. So it's out there, but this one goes between carriers, and I think that added some complexity to it. So anyway, that is, whether recession's looming or not, that's a real vulnerability that I did not know about 9 days ago. Crazy.
That's interesting. And that another vulnerability that we've had to fix, this was early on, several years ago, which is on the dual factor authentication, is so you're trying to do work on an airplane and you can get a Wi-Fi signal. But then you put in your password, and then it's like, oh, we're going to send the verification to your email. Well, you can't get into your email without the verification. So it's a chicken and egg thing. So they fixed that by at some point giving us one of those little kind of a pager. I was going to say beeper, pager looking things. And then now there's an app on our phone, and the original app had to be connected to Wi-Fi. And you're like, okay, yeah, that isn't going to work. So now it rolls on its own. It's like a self-fulfilling thing that just rolls all the time in the background. And so it's things like that. But it got me thinking that, those people where the authentication comes to somewhere where you may not have access to because you need to authenticate in order to get the access to, you may want to rethink about that. And I think many people don't think about it until they are right in the middle of it, like on an airplane at 30,000 feet in the air.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we use Duo Push tied to this phone, Thomson Reuters, and it has rolling every 60 seconds, new numbers tied to this phone. So it's like, and purchases that were tied to this phone with Apple Pay that didn't initially say denied, but then I find out, like, why didn't I get a receipt for this airfare and for an appliance that blew out in our house? And then I had to call those people. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you think about business disruption. A few years ago, we had, it wasn't with us, but it was another CPA firm that I know these guys, and we were doing a seminar together about 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, they got hit with ransomware, and they got shut down for a week. What do you do? What do you do? I mean, this is like serious stuff. And I think I saw a headline yesterday that somebody had gotten phone numbers for NATO or something like that. It's just a brief headline. And I was on the phone with this a cellular company, so I couldn't. I lost it. But I thought, is it even possible? Like, can somebody hijack your phone number? Probably. I probably. So anyway, I'm thinking I've got to go do some MacGyvering and do some deeper dive into some of the security folks out there, because this is like a crazy thing. I mean, and there are plenty of malicious people out there. This was a completely innocent thing. Somebody just made a really big mistake. But anyway, it's just interesting. And if you, here's a pro tip on hacking the CEO's email address. Find the CEO of the company, make sure that it's relevant and current, then go to Zoom Info. You can get their email address, you can buy it, and I chose not to buy it, but I saw first initial, 3 asterisks, and then I knew what their nomenclature for the company was, which is not what you would think it is. So then I knew his first name, and it could have been an abbreviated first name. So that was one option. Knew what his middle name and the middle initial was. That's another option. And then we hit. So just in case.
I think you found your next job in case you get bored. It's like, okay, you're MacGyvering. You're a private investigator. Well,
That's some crazy stuff.
Here's another random tip. The other day driving around with my wife and driving her car, and I get out of the car and I'm like, okay, I'm waiting. And I start walking away. And so she follows up behind me. She comes, follows me, and I push the lock button on her key. And she's like, don't do that. I'm like, why? I need to lock the car. She's like, well, because people can take the codes. I'm like, that's myth. And then so she proved it to me that it's not myth. And what happens is, like a lot of cars, you have to push once for the driver, twice for all the other doors. So it's a matter of how many presses. So they'll kind of be around you. Like if it's someone who like they know your pattern of driving, they'll wait for you, and then they'll start recording this. And after a course of time, they will have that code. I'm like, okay, fine.
Wow.
Yeah. So I thought that was BS, but I guess, why not? It's a radio signal, right? I thought those things were impenetrable as far as copying those signals, but I guess it's the repetitive nature of it that someone would have to be targeting you to do that. It's not like somebody next to you in a parking lot of a supermarket is going to be able to get it on one try, supposedly. So Cliff Clavin, Jack, Dad, fact.
Yeah, and Papa Joe, listen, I don't know how to hack, and I wouldn't anyway. All I'm saying is this is free information out there. And I'm not protesting on the front lawn of the CEO. I just needed to get an email and say, I am desperate. Can you please help? That was it. And I wasn't. Now I did call David Redding, litigator, and like, dude, I am not a litigious person, but is there anything I should be doing? Like anything? And so hats off to David Redding. He called me and I go, dude, I think I got a hold of the CEO. Goes, even better. Threats, I guess, will get you so and so far, but that's just going to prolong it anymore. It's like I needed access to my stinking phone so I could do timesheets and log important things that I needed to for my business. So enough about that. So Jack, do you have any other like tidbits from what's happening in this crazy world? There's been all kinds of crazy stuff happening. Anything?
Yeah. So one thing of interest, and I didn't know this, but it sounds like that there's a rule that's going into effect on July 6th. So happy Independence Day. But so earlier this month, the SBA, they issued a final rule. So it's basically, I think we're all very familiar with final rules that maybe are not so final during the PPP process. But so they issued what they normally issue, which is the proclamation that so they're modifying the methodology for calculating the size of small businesses using an employee-based size standard, and authorizes businesses participating in business loan, disaster loan, surety bond, and small business investment company programs to choose whether to use a 3-year or a 5-year receipts average when determining eligibility. It becomes effective on July 6th. So basically, and specifically, it says increases the period for calculating employee-based size standards from 12 months to a 24-month trailing average and applies to all SBA small business and socioeconomic programs. So that is just a way of telling you that if you are going for an SBA loan and it's employee-based, that their employee and revenue-based, like all those factors, one of those significant factors is changing. They usually give you a little bit of runway to do that and to switch over, and sometimes even to choose. You remember the 8 and 24 weeks issue from a couple of years, it seems like a couple of years ago, several months ago, with PPP loan periods, is that this is July 6th. They're flipping a switch. And so that's happening. So if I don't know what that means for applicants or borrowers that are midstream in the process, that if you've locked in whatever you've locked in and now it's going to process normally, or if there's going to be a look back and you may have to provide additional information for those SBA loans that are in process and have not closed before July 6th. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I know we want to get back to talking about the core of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I'm just curious from your standpoint, Jack, from a legal standpoint. We've talked a lot from an accounting standpoint and really just from a business numbers standpoint. What are the things that you should be doing? Make sure that you're buttoned up on a number of things, even from communication standpoints, but from your numbers, is there anything from a legal perspective that you go, especially during recessionary times, these are the things that you should be being very watchful for and do?
So I think maybe touching on 2 core areas. One is corporate discipline. And I don't mean bad behavior in the hallways. I mean documentation discipline. And a lot of times it just gets easy to keep going and going and going because you only have so many hours in the day. You're dealing with things that maybe you weren't dealing with before. Maybe you have more debtors out there, so you're having to deal with more collections and those kind of things. And so sometimes business owners and the employees more so get the that's good enough attitude. And I think that's very dangerous because then that's good enough attitude becomes the norm and kind of the standard operating procedure. And then when it comes down to there being an issue and you have to enforce a contract, it's like, so where are the standard terms and conditions that are supposed to get attached to every single invoice that goes out the door? Oh, well, we just scan the first one, that we just scan the invoice and send it to them. And, they signed and scanned it back to us. And so you can imagine the difficulty in trying to enforce terms and conditions that the other side can very easily say, we never got those. And so then you have to go through a whole bunch of other stuff saying, yeah, you did, because this is what was sent to you. And, it's a he said, she said kind of thing. So there's that aspect of it, which is maintain the corporate discipline and on the front end. Then it goes to kind of the back end, which is storing information, having things in order. When you go through due diligence, it is a pleasure to see a well-organized entity documentation, whether it is them sending us folders in a zip file, or if it is access to something that they have that shows that, okay, when they say that these are the material contracts, or if we as sellers counsel have to provide what are the material contracts, it is painful to have someone have to go through boxes of stuff. And usually, I mean, as an associate many years ago, that was me doing that. I mean, I would say it's kind of cost prohibitive to even have an associate do that now. So it's usually someone that is, low person on the totem pole at that organization that's having to go through boxes and then exercise judgment as to whether something is material or not. So that's the other thing too, is that maybe something gets missed and it's not because, you don't have maybe someone that has not necessarily the legal acumen, but just the business acumen, even with guidelines. It's like, oh, okay, a contract that is worth $50 million or $50,000. What does that mean? Is that in the aggregate over the course of time for that contract? Or is it like the one-time payment? What is it? So just having all that stuff organized will be very helpful, because then if you have to go back to it and be efficient, but I see that, it just makes normal business operations difficult, because you have to go back and find things. So if you want to enforce things, or for example, renewing a contract, it's like, well, where's the prior contract so we can use that as the launching point moving forward? Everybody knows what the contract says because they've been living and breathing it for 5 years or whatever the term of the contract is. But then it's like, well, okay, this is the contract. Well, but technically there's been 5 amendments to it, but there've been ladies and gentlemen's arrangements. So again, going back to the discipline of the inline operational in the moment discipline, to say, yeah, that's good enough, we know what's supposed to happen, versus documenting it. I also appreciate that, it can get somewhat expensive. Sometimes clients will come to me and say, this is what I need done. And then we look at the contract. We're like, well, have you thought about these other things that are in here? I didn't know that was in there. Or yeah, it's in there, but we don't really pay attention to that. I'm like, yes, I understand that, until you are required to pay attention to it because someone is trying to enforce it, or they're saying, well, you haven't enforced it before, so you can't automatically switch to enforcing this and saying, aha, gotcha, you've breached the agreement. So now here are all the consequences for breaching, when you haven't, through the course of your performance with that customer or client, been doing that. I mean, you can go back to doing that, but a lot of times it is inequitable to start enforcing the strict terms of the contract without giving notice and kind of a cure period to do that. That is, generally speaking, that is not in every case. So don't please think that, okay, you can't strictly enforce a contract, or that you're going to get leeway to then proceed with or comply with a contract, but only after you get warning that you're not in compliance with it. So it goes both ways, but generally speaking, there's a fairness kind of applied to that. So really those, it kind of, I guess it really falls under kind of a compliance umbrella of following the procedures, and don't get academically lazy. Again, I'm not being accusatory. I'm just saying it stuff happens, life happens. You lose people. We've been talking about, the great resignation and how that's impacting businesses. So, maybe someone who was your documents person is no longer working for you. So you're getting by with what you can, but, at least keep track of that stuff. So that way you can, have the appropriate files when you need them. So I would say that is really kind of like the biggest thing from a legal perspective, which is as you would expect. It's like, okay, document, enforce the documents, and because it really gets difficult to try to enforce a verbal agreement. Now, in this day and age, and it has been this way for a while, emails back and forth, and you have to be careful with what you say and what you do. I am not proposing that every sensitive conversation be only by phone or in person, but understand that, since the beginning uses of emails as communication, that is discoverable, unless it's between attorney and client, but those emails are discoverable. Those ones that you say, okay, keep this out of the chain of communications, or just between you and me. It's never between you and me. You just have to operate in that fashion, because it may come back to bite you. And there have been times where I'm like, okay, I have to be careful what I say, even though it's attorney-client privilege. That, okay, let's have a discussion about these things so that you can make a decision. And then, especially if you make the wrong decision, it's not like I told you so kind of thing. Usually clients will follow our advice, but sometimes they do their own thing and they're insistent. And in some of those cases, those are no longer our clients. So it's the way it goes.
So You bring up the issue of contracts. So we just had a business growth workshop. It's a boot camp. We started this from when we bought Jim Dunn's Sandler franchise. And we make that available to all of our BGW business clients. And we don't charge for it. It's like $1,000 typically. So if you're a BGW client and you're on here and you have not done that, let me know. The next one's going to be in September, but it's like I sit in on every one of them and I learn something new, but it's basically talking about, what do you want? Some vision casting a little bit and what's holding you back. It's basically a half-day session. But one of the things that came out that was a big topic of discussion, and it's just BGW business owners and kind of their number twos typically, was this whole thing on contracts and price increases, because we've got people that are in the construction world, commercial, residential, and trades that apply to those things. And it's interesting because one of the guys who has, he does a land clearing and then also grading, big lot grading for construction. He said, one thing that we've started to do is I have my attorney review every contract now. He said, I didn't before, but he said, there's so much, building materials delays and all the supply chain challenges have caused a lot of angst. And you have some clients and some big companies in particular, if you're dealing with big companies, they will stick you because of that language. They will stick you, and it's just what it's the cost of doing business with some of these big companies, unfortunately. Other people may be a little bit more reasonable, but I think it's really, really important. And so we were talking about, well, what do you do when you sign a contract and you got everything and then there's 90 days of delay and the prices have gone up, by 30% in some cases. What do you do? So that really is a recession proofing move. The other thing that was interesting too is we talked a little bit about this with concentration risk. A lot of companies have concentration risk, and man, in recessionary periods in particular, that's a really big danger zone. This one guy has 90% of his business tied up in one, or actually two big clients. Terrifying. What do you do if it goes wobbly? One thing that Tana Green, shout out to Tana Green, she gave me this book, The On Purpose Business Person. Woo! It's a good modern parable, and it actually uses, so if you've read Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, that kind of premise, where it's a real life situation, fictional names, but very applicable. This is a fast read. It's like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, but I bought one for Adam and I said, you're going to read it and we're going to discuss it. So that's a good one. The other thing that I've seen too, timely and accurate financials. We talked a little bit about this, but I was with a business owner this week that has a number of businesses, and you would think that as successful as this business owner is, he would have accurate financials. And he's like, man, we're still waiting on April numbers. I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, you're cruising down Highway 77 at 80 miles an hour, and you're not supposed to be going that fast, but you are. And the windshield's painted black. You can't see. All you got is a rear view mirror from back to April. That's terrifying. And so a lot of people don't want to know that, but it's like, it becomes even more important in rocky times to know exactly where you're at and have meaningful metrics, like meaningful dashboards. If you don't have that, find somebody to help you. And there are great fractional CFOs that can help you do that. If you've got a bookkeeping service, enlist that bookkeeping service. And if they can't do that and they can't turn it fast enough, find somebody different. So that's my plug on that thing.
So another thing about documentation is, and I see this, is that the evolution of a document. So kind of the in and outs of going through legal counsel, which is we have a client that, we drafted a document for, or we revised it. And then, a couple of years go by, get the call, hey, we want you to take a look at our documents and make sure that they're still good. And so like, okay, so what I now do and have been doing for some time now is I take that document they send to me and redline it against the document that I sent to them in prior years. What happens in most cases is that, yeah, there's been some slight changes, but there's some substantive changes that may be purposeful, may be applicable moving forward and want to be kept into the document. But many times there is language that it was deal specific to a particular transaction. And then that document was changed and that became the new base document. That is why, for example, with my franchisor clients, that I strongly suggest to them that any changes are done via addendum or amendments. Addenda meaning at the time the franchise agreement is signed, so there's switches to the franchise agreement, or amendments after the fact, maybe months or years after the agreement has been signed, so that the original document is preserved in its original form and you don't accidentally use that potentially negotiated form for a deal moving forward. It happens inevitably, like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that is in that document. Who put that in there? Being somewhat maybe accusatory towards us, but I don't take it personally. And come to find out, no, it was someone that was negotiating on behalf of the client that put that in there because they agreed to it. And then that became the form because they, again, document discipline. You either make the form a read-only form, so it's impossible to save over, or you get in the habit of hitting save as every time you use that document. Now, I think it's safer to protect the document that forces you to do something differently, meaning to save it, but to each their own. But that happens inevitably too, which is just have your warehouse of documents and keep them consistent and make the deal changes via a separate document if appropriate, or extract that document, do a save as, and then go from there. Don't save over the original documents. And it's easy to do if you haven't protected it and you just accidentally hit that save button. I do it sometimes, and then I have to go back and import a prior version from an email that I sent out back into the document stream to make sure that is in, that's showing as the prior version of the document that I just obliterated with new changes, essentially. So
that makes sense. Something that Jim Dunn said Tuesday in this that I thought was really interesting. He said, in every recessionary cycle, that's when his business does better, which is sales training and that sort of thing. He said complacency basically, equals danger, because it's like, hey, stuff is just flowing over the transom. We don't have a sales problem. Everybody has a sales problem. Everybody needs to grow top line. You better have margins, that's really important. And those are some of the levers that a good CPA firm will help you with. But I thought that was interesting. And he said, that in tumultuous times, that's when opportunity really exists. And if you think about it in your own business, if you were able to pivot, the people that were able to pivot, this is kind of a general observation that I've seen since March 2020. Got to see it firsthand, up close and personal. I've been through more than one recession, obviously, but with this one in particular, with all the client base that we have, got to see a lot of patterns. And that the ones that went well, even if their industries were really negatively impacted, the ones that went well, typically, and I'm not trying to sell outside coaching, but had an outside coach, or they had a framework where their team was communicated with and they were aligned and the team was collectively solving the problem, and they were proactive about it. They saw storm clouds on the horizon and they were moving. The ones that didn't and hoped for the best, oh, well, hopefully 2 weeks to flatten the curve, that'll be good. Whew, that didn't happen. Just didn't happen. And some of those people are no longer in business. And I've got a couple friends that is what happened. They just kind of head in the sand. Hopefully it'll pass. And they didn't have framework. So I just think it's, again, lessons learned. It's kind of the Pennzoil commercial. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. It's a lot cheaper to change your oil than to have your engine seize up because you haven't been taking care of the engine. So,
and Gary, you had mentioned you got into talking about some specifics on financials and the balance sheet. And I think this applies to all the financials, in that if you don't have audited financials, you may want to think about creating your own narrative that normally would appear in audited financial statements, because it is, and this happened earlier in the week, looking at financials of a company, and I'm like, wow, there is, what is this line item for intercompany debt? And the explanation was that this company was a co-signer on a loan. But rather than showing it as its own liability, it was showing it as intercompany debt. I'm not sure if that's the right way to do that, but at least, but I had to ask for that explanation rather than it sitting there, because, raise my antenna as soon as I see that. I mean, like, for example, when I'm reviewing financials, which I don't do necessarily for prospect franchisees, that's really a business decision they need to do. But I do, if you're with, if they are seeking to be into a mature franchise system, meaning plus 3 years of existence, they're required to provide audited financials, 3 years history of it, if they have it. But at least, the first year of their third year, full audited financials. And so I look at it, and so I will alert a prospect franchisee client of mine to things that I see that are anomalous. But I had the benefit of, before I raise something, I can go look at the comments potentially and the notes to those financials, to the audited financials, and see the explanation. So, it is helpful that if you don't have audited financials, that, and it will, excuse me, it causes you as a business owner to start thinking about things like, okay, wait a minute, why is this still on the books? Why is there not a declining balance on this? Are we making decisions to carry a loan balance moving forward at a higher interest rate? So maybe we refinance some debt as interest rates. I mean, now would probably not be the best of time. In prior months, maybe yes, when interest rates are a little bit lower, but as they creep up because of to combat inflation, maybe not such a good time to do that. But at least you're thinking about it and thinking of ways, because we had talked about that last week, as when you're looking at your financials, that is there a way to reduce your debt or your debt servicing obligation, meaning interest rate, et cetera, fees potentially, in doing that. And create competition for that. So, in looking at, I just a little personal financial on me is that I like to have a home equity line. We don't use it. It's for emergencies. I mean, we've used it occasionally for little projects, but we don't carry a balance for a particular period of time. At when we did a refi of our mortgage last year, we shut that down just to have one less thing that has to be dealt with in the course of the refinance. But so I haven't had a HELOC in over a year. And I'm like, I probably should go get it before the rates continue to go up. And so I pit 4 banks against each other. And I'm like, okay. And I was very clear. I said, look, I love you to my own banker, which happens to be the highest rate out of all of them. But wow. I mean, it's a home equity line. So it's like, okay, who really wants it? And interestingly, some of the smaller, the credit unions and some of the smaller community banks are able to provide for a lower interest rate with no cost. In case you're looking for a home equity line, there are lenders out there with lower interest rates and no costs. Now, I had to be specific because when I say no cost, I mean no out-of-pocket cost. They pay for the appraisal, they pay for all this stuff, the closing costs, the filing fees, et cetera. And then one came back and said, well, we meant no origination points. I'm like, okay. So
you're dealing with a lawyer here.
yeah, make sure you're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. But my point is going back to, your financials, that there may be ways to do things a little differently, but then also explain things that may seem anomalous. I mean, what's going on, but it's like, okay, put yourself in the position of somebody looking at your financials and not understanding why there is this multi-million-dollar intercompany loan, which is really, I think, a direct loan as a co-borrower in that circumstance. And so we had to have a discussion with that. And why is it that way? And, they weren't our financials. So it wasn't my client's financials, they were someone else's financials. So we was suggested that they would take another look at that to see if it was classified properly.
So I'm curious, Jack, we've seen some downturns since you and I've been practicing business. And since you deal with franchisees and franchisors, you've seen it done right when people are in trouble during these downturns, and you've seen when they didn't pay attention and they didn't do it right. I'm just curious, what do you give me an example of somebody that did it wrong and it came back to bite them when things started sliding, and somebody that did it right?
So I
and
think
Joe, we'll
that
get to your question here too.
I think that I guess a really good example is a personal guarantee when you have to give one. And I tell clients and people, I think there are 4 scenarios where you have to give a personal guarantee. One is for a loan. Another is to a landlord. Another is to a franchisor. And the 4th is to your lawyers, who are not going to sign you up with your newly formed LLC. Now, I want a personal guarantee with you on the line when you sign my engagement letter. And so even in those circumstances, I've never had anybody negotiate with me. I had some people say they were not going to sign the personal guarantee, and then we had to make a credit decision whether we want to do that or not. But I encourage my tenant clients, my franchisee clients, to try and negotiate that personal guarantee. In many cases, there's not a whole lot of leverage to do that. So you try to find creative ways to deal with that. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think there is a 2 misconceptions with respect to personal guarantees. The first is that they have to go after the borrower first, and then get a judgment, and then not get paid, and then come after the guarantor. Most guarantees are very direct, and you're principally liable as a guarantor on the debt, whether it's a lease, whether it's a loan, whether it's to the franchisor. The other misconception is that it only applies to what is owed at the time. So for example, let's say a franchisee hasn't paid royalties for 6 months. It's like, oh, that's all that's owed. So I have essentially a limited guarantee, which is not true. If you read the fine print, it is for anything that is due and payable by whoever you're guaranteeing the debt for example, the franchisee entity. And that could include attorney's fees. It could include interest. It could include acceleration of certain obligations like royalties and advertising fund fees. So, again, you try to limit that. And sometimes it is, well, if it's a 10-year term, after 5 years, whether or not we are good. And if we have been good stewards of paying back the money, then maybe there's a limited guarantee. And it is, for example, one instance, you get to the 5-year mark, and then from year 5 forward, if you've paid timely, meaning you've paid and there's been cure and there's no other breach of the agreement at the time of the end of that 5th year, going into your 6th year, it may be that you're only guaranteeing what is owed in year 6, and then it resets to year 7. So it's a rolling rolling year average, sometimes even a rolling 12 months. So it's like, January, then February, then March, plus 12 months. So there are ways to limit that. I guess a third misunderstanding or misconception with respect to personal guarantees is when a let's say it is the wife that owns the business 100% is pledging her assets as collateral, and they say, oh yeah, we want your spouse to sign. Yeah, okay, fine, no big deal. Well, in certain states like North Carolina, it is a big deal, because if the original deed to you was done correctly, then it's intended, and you're married and you remain married, it's tenancy by the entireties, which is a fancy way of saying that you each have technically 1/2 interest in the property, but it's indivisible. So it is not that a creditor of one of the spouses can go and liquidate that entire house, get the equity out, pay the non-debtor spouse half, and then take the other half themselves to satisfy part of that judgment. Whereas you would be able to do that on other things, like, for example, a car, or even like potentially a second home. Now, you do have bankruptcy protections, but this is outside of bankruptcy, where you have a bank exercising on their collateral. And so they think that, well, that is protected, because I was told when we signed that, oh, you have this marital protection. And so it's like, okay, I'll sign. But that is not the case. When a spouse signs a personal guarantee, any and all joint property, even tenancy by entirety's property, is on the line for that debt. So I am very explicit with my franchisee prospect clients when I am told that it's only one spouse that's really getting in, is really the business operator, but they ask the other spouse to sign a personal guarantee. On the flip side of things, if I'm representing the franchisor or the landlord, you better believe I am strongly suggesting to my clients to get a spousal guarantee. I have no idea. My client, franchisor client, my landlord client has no idea. Well, I shouldn't say that. Landlords probably have a better idea because they're going to do some financial due diligence. Franchisors do some of it, but it's okay. You're taking their word for it on a personal financial statement sometimes, because a lot of times you're not submitting tax returns, personal tax returns, but sometimes you are. But it is that, so rather than take the risk that there has been, and even subsequent, it could be that everything looks fine, but then a month after, everything gets transferred. A lot of assets get transferred to the non-owner operator spouse. Now, there are laws against doing things like that. It's called a fraudulent conveyance, when you're trying to avoid debt or abscond from debt. So it's not that you can readily do that. But, it's like, okay, well, let's, move some assets offshore. Let's do this, let's do that kind of thing. So we always want both spouses on the line if possible. Like anything else, we'll have people say, no, she does our business lives are separate from our personal lives, and we're going to keep it that way. And it's no deal. Sometimes you're on the other end, which is there's no deal unless they sign up or provide us with your financials. And then maybe the guarantee is secondary rather than primary. So I would say that is, so I kind of answered your question by doing both sides of it, which is the correct way to do it and the incorrect way to do it, with the caveat that you may not be able to do it the correct way. And the second caveat that the correct way depends on your perspective, whether you are the lender or the debtor in those various scenarios.
That's awesome. So you mentioned something that kind of queued me up. And so I sent a text to Joe Saley. He's with Jay Galt. And there are a couple of companies out there that will help you build your business credit score so that you can get your name off personal guarantees. Well, a lot of times people don't realize, and they just keep getting stuck with these personal guarantees. Now, it doesn't help if you're buying a franchise and you just left corporate America, that doesn't help. But there are two companies, and if you are interested in this, there's nothing in it for me. I'm just telling you, Jay Galt is one and Credit Suite is another one. And Joe Saley knows that industry pretty doggone well. And he's been a business owner too, had Title IX boxing, et cetera. And And so if anybody is interested in that, feel free to connect with me and I'll connect you with no strings. But that's another really interesting thing. And one of the things that I liked about Jay Galt, when I looked at that suite of services, they actively help you build your business credit score, but then they also do kind of a company valuation that's part of this, and it's much cheaper than it would be going through most channels, including us. So just check them out. Joe raises a great point here. One thing people have in company traveling is to put a line item in service contracts to adjust for fuel prices and fuel price increases. Set thresholds, and that's a really good point. You know, these guys on Tuesday were talking about, you know, in the industry, there are asphalt things that move up and down, but there are other things that, and that's kind of an industry standard, but now people are getting stung because of these crazy price increases and then time elongation in the contracts just because of supply chain issues from people or goods, et cetera. So good point, Joe. Thank you for weighing in on that.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that too in the form of fuel surcharges, both on a professional, meaning legal level with contracts and the ability to do certain things, but also on the consumer level. I got a little bit additional payment due from our garbage collection company in South Charlotte, charging us a fuel surcharge, and apparently it's variable. And they back charged it and then they forward charged it just in case. I'm like, but you don't know what the charge is. So you're basically taking my money and borrowing it incrementally. So then, so of course I have fundamental issues with paying something in advance and then allowing them to basically use my money because, multiply that. And I will not also, I will also not disclose the name of that company because, they've been pretty good to us. So, but yes, so that in the form of, and then so reviewing contracts, I get the question all the time is like, what can we do? Are we permitted to modify the terms and conditions of our contracts? And the ones that are in short-term, so the detriment and the benefit of being in a short-term contract, again, depending on your perspective, which is, okay, so I went back and looked at my garbage waste services contract to see, and it's a short-term contract. It's not even really a contract. It's kind of like, I think they have to, each party has to give 30 days notice if they want to fire me, if I want to fire them. And that's it. So very short term. And so they're like, take it or leave it, and I was like, okay, well, obviously I'm going to take it because the other waste services companies are not so good in that area of town because we've tried them. But I mean, it's so, but yeah, fuel surcharges, other things. I've seen also and you pricing this as well in restaurants that there is, and it's been like this in various restaurants, but a tip line for your server and a tip line for the kitchen staff, right? And so, some people are like, well, wait a minute. And it's funny because people don't know what to do with that. It's like, okay, do I pull some from the server's tip and give it to to the back, the people in the back? And I think that what happens is that they're supposed to share amongst themselves, right? And so, but just little things like that, and constantly getting asked, can I do this? Can I do that to offset this and that versus raising the price? That is to me a psychological thing where it is, okay, the promise from this waste company was that this is just a temporary measure and that eventually it'll go away when fuel prices come back down. Like, okay, so basically it's a permanent thing, at least in the short term, medium term. But then others are like, well, let's just put it back into, let's just increase the costs. I mean, everybody knows that everything is increasing in costs. So you have an expectation that it's going to increase your utilities, your food and everything else. So why play these silly little reindeer games and put it in a separate line item? We're just going to increase it. And people are not really going to feel it necessarily individually. They'll feel it in the aggregate. It's like I had to, I have certain notifications on our credit cards, like for my kids and for ourselves. And, foreign transaction fees and stuff like that. And my phone was beeping all the time on things that, like, for grocery bills, and it's not set at a low number, but it was going over that number consistently. It was like, okay,
Wow.
so let me reset it to higher so that I'm not bothered with it, just knowing that, when one of us goes shopping, that it's going to be more expensive than it is for buying the same stuff we've always bought. So
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We've had more alerts. I think the credit card companies are, being even more mindful lately. And I've had I've had two, like I had a Father's Day gift reveal unintentionally because credit card calls is like, hey, did you make this purchase? I'm like, no, Jen, what's going on? And she's like, well, it was your birthday. Yeah, I mean, your Father's Day gift. And then, it's like, but we've gotten more of those, and it wasn't like, something crazy and extravagant, but I think they're being mindful and watching too. So I think, the takeaway from today is there are simple things that we can do, but just being lazy and complacent, now's not a good time for that. It's especially not. We got to be really sharp in case, we are in a recession or we're going into one, and who knows how long. It's time to just be diligent and vigilant. So, well, we're right up close to the top of the hour. So I hope everybody has a great and safe Independence Day weekend. Enjoy your families and stay hydrated. That's right.
I've had this flag in my the cup that holds all my pens and pencils and highlighters, and it's fine. I mean, you can't see it, but it's like super faded. I've had it for, I don't know, maybe 15, 16 years. Someone gave it to me.
I have the same thing. And this is the Costa Rica flag, which is funny that Adam's there, but this is Costa Rica flag because my oldest son lived in Costa Rica with an indigenous family. They only spoke Spanish, so he was there for a semester, and he was pretty fluent in Spanish, and he was extremely fluent when he got home. So anyway, happy Independence Day. Jack, thanks so much. It's always fun being with you. And everybody, thanks for joining us. If you came late, we'll put it up on the BGWCPA YouTube channel later on today.
Thank you.
Have a good one. See y'all. Bye-bye.